At the table, Greg Ip of The Economist. He is U.S. economics editor. Good morning to you.
Morning, Paul.
Thanks for being here. Let's take a temperature of the U.S. economy. How is it doing overall?
Well, it's interesting, Paul. If you go back a year ago, it looked very similar. We were growing at around 2% per year, creating around 150,000 to 200,000 jobs per month. But even though the raw numbers are very similar, the outlook is quite different. A year ago, we were heading into a period where we were still trying to negotiate our way through a number of crises, in particular Europe. We still had to get past the fiscal cliff of spending cuts and higher taxes. A year later, we've absorbed all those shocks to the system, and it looks actually like things are looking up. There isn't going to be any new fiscal austerity next year. Employment growth seems to be becoming more entrenched with the unemployment rate dropping. The crisis in Europe is fading into the rearview mirror, and it looks like people's spirits, especially in the stock market, are quite buoyant. So I'd say the outlook is quite solid. Next year could be the best year we've had since the recession ended back in 2009. What
still needs to be worked on? Where are the not so bright spots right now?
Well, it's still the case that we do have austerity in the pipeline. If you look at some of the numbers, this year it's estimated that higher taxes and reduced government spending removed 1.5 percentage points off the growth rate. Next year that'll be around 0.5 percentage point, so we still have to deal with that. We have not yet seen the full absorption of the realization that the Federal Reserve is going to begin dialing back some of its stimulus programs. As that realization sinks in, we could see higher interest rates, and that could weaken the housing market. We could see a pullback in the stock market. That could hurt confidence. And more generally, forecasts like the one I just gave you, which was relatively upbeat for next year, we've given the same forecast every year for the last 3 or 4 years, and each year something seems to come along to set us back, so we need to be aware of that.
Our guest is Greg Ip of The Economist. Phone numbers on the bottom of the screen. As again, we take a temperature of current conditions, what is working, what still needs to be worked on, what next year might be like. Lines for Republicans and Democrats and independents out there. We also have a separate line just for the unemployed. If you're still looking for work, call this number, 202-585-3883. And, of course, we'll take your tweets and your comments by email as well. Our guest has written what a lot of other folks have been writing about lately, and that's the 100th anniversary of the formation of the Federal Reserve. And here is a look at the Economist story on it. Age shall not weary her is the headline. Tell us more about the significance of the birthday.
So there's an old saying that there's only 2 things that can get Congress to act: crisis and Christmas. And dealing with the aftermath of the Great Panic of 1907 had both those elements. Over the following 6 years, a number of commissions in Congress tried to come up with a permanent solution to the panics that had gripped the United States repeatedly over the last 40 or 50 years. And the solution was to create a central bank. But there was a great deal of debate over what shape that central bank should have. Should it be run by bankers or by the government? And not until Woodrow Wilson, in his first year in office, forced the 2 sides to compromise were they ready to produce a bill, which he signed today, 100 years ago today. And it's interesting, Paul, because some things never seem to change. We are still having many of the same fights that we had 100 years ago. Are bankers too powerful in the deliberations of the Federal Reserve? Is it doing enough for Main Street versus Wall Street? Is it too powerful?
We'll hear from Ben Bernanke in just a moment, but ask Greg Ip first about the Fed move last week, the tapering, if that's the right word to use. How important is that, and what are the next moves? What are the next signals?
I think we could call this not the end, but perhaps the beginning of the end. And by which I mean, if you go back to 2008, when the crisis was at its worst point and the recession was beginning, the Federal Reserve threw all its conventional ammunition at it. They lowered the short-term interest rate all the way to 0, which left them without any more traditional tools to try and help the economy out. So they initiated what became known as quantitative easing, the purchase of long-term bonds paid for by simply creating money out of thin air. And they did that in 2 successive rounds, which did not succeed in producing the sort of upward momentum that they wanted. So they began a 3rd round last September 2012, which became colloquially known as QE3, with the wrinkle that they weren't going to stop until they were convinced that the economy was getting better. And in the last few months, Ben Bernanke and his colleagues at the Federal Reserve concluded that that benchmark had been reached. The economy was getting better, and they could begin to dial this thing back. Now, it's important to point out that they did not say we're going to 0, we're going to stop it right away. And they certainly didn't say we're going to raise interest rates. They're not saying they're going to tighten monetary policy. They're merely saying they're going to loosen it at a slightly lower rate. Hopefully a year by now, the whole process will be done. They will not be purchasing any new bonds.
Let's hear from the Fed chair as he made his announcement last week.
As you know, we've been purchasing $85 billion per month in longer-term Treasury and agency mortgage-backed securities. Starting in January, we will be purchasing $75 billion of securities a month, reducing purchases of Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities by $5 billion each. It's important to note, though, that even after this reduction, we will be still expanding our holdings of longer-term securities at a rapid pace. We will also continue to roll over maturing Treasury securities and reinvest principal payments from the Federal Reserve's holdings of agency debt and agency mortgage-backed securities into agency mortgage-backed securities. Our sizable and still increasing holdings will continue to put downward pressure on longer-term interest rates, support mortgage markets, and make financial conditions more accommodative, which in turn should promote further progress in the labor market and help move inflation back toward the committee's objective of 2%. Our modest reduction in the pace of asset purchases reflects the committee's belief that progress towards its economic objectives will be sustained. If the incoming data broadly support the committee's outlook for employment and inflation, we will likely reduce the pace of securities purchases in further measured steps at future meetings. Of course, continued progress is by no means certain. Consequently, future adjustments to the pace of asset purchases will be deliberate and dependent on incoming information.
So Greg Ip of The Economist, what does all of that mean to the average American?
Well, so just to take the most basic aspect of that, one of the aims of the bond buying program is to hold down long-term Treasury yields. Essentially, when you buy a bond, you push up the price, and that pushes down the interest rate on it. And because mortgage rates are usually linked closely to bond yields, the more these bonds they bought, the more it held down mortgage interest rates. Over the last 8 months, as the market became aware that the Federal Reserve would pull back on this program, they began to sell off bonds and interest rates moved up. So we saw some rebound in mortgage interest rates. What Mr. Bernanke hopes is that by gradually continuing the process over the coming year, that there will not be additional upward pressure on mortgage interest rates, but hopefully there won't be any further downward pressure. More important, I think, is it's his vote of confidence in the durability of the recovery. The fact that they feel that the economy no longer needs this extraordinary continuing additions of support suggests that they finally think that the moment has come when the expansion has become self-sustaining.
And that made the markets go up toward the end of that last
I think
week.
there's an old saying on Wall Street, sell the rumor, buy the news. The fact that they were going to pull back had been the subject of rumor for weeks as the economic data began getting stronger. By the time the rumor became fact, all the selling had been done, and perhaps some buyers finally came out of the woodwork.
Let's hear from Barbara. First call for Greg Ip of The Economist, Kalamazoo, Michigan. Good morning.
Good morning. I've been watching you folks for quite a while, and I'd like to know, you talk about the bonds and the things, and to get people to buy them more and get involved more. We've lost enough money out of all this nonsense. You know, I don't quite know how to put it in sentences, but all of us little people, you say we've had, not just you, but everybody's saying we've had all these jobs growth. Service, maybe. You can't make a living on McDonald's or on pressing clothes or babysitting. You can't do that.
Thanks, Barbara. She's touching on many different parts of the economy. Speak first about the last thing she mentioned, minimum wage.
Sure. Well, let's talk about the nature of job growth. It is the case that we have had steady job growth. We've created roughly 7 million jobs since the bottom of the economy back in late 2009, early 2010. And the unemployment rate has come down from 10% to 7%. So on the surface, that sounds like good news. But as the caller was referring to, beneath the surface, there are some troubling aspects. One of them is that it is the case that we've created jobs in the goods producing sector. The automobile industry, for example, has added quite a few thousand jobs since the bottom. But those don't begin to make up for the huge loss of jobs that occurred in the years prior to that. And it is certainly the case that many of the jobs created pay very low wages. And more generally speaking, the rate of wage growth that the people who have jobs have enjoyed in the last 4 or 5 years hasn't been even enough to cover the inflation they've experienced. So real wages have suffered. So that's a long way of saying that even though we've made a lot of progress in the last 4 or 5 years, it's disappointing relative to historic benchmarks, and we have a long way to go. In particular, getting the job market strong enough that people can begin to get bigger better wage increases.
Let's dig a little deeper into the unemployment numbers with our guest, Greg Ip of The Economist. In November, the unemployment rates were as follows. Adult men, 6.7%. Adult women, 6.2%. Teenagers, 20.8%, almost 21% for teenagers. Whites, 6.2%. Blacks, 12.5% unemployment. Hispanics, 8.7% unemployment. Tell us more.
So the differentials that you're identifying, for example, minorities and young people having higher unemployment rates than prime-age males and whites, those disparities have existed for a very long time. They existed even when the economy was quite strong. It is the case that those groups did suffer more as the economy worsened, but those things have also come in a little bit in the last 3 or 4 years. There's something that people often talk about, which is not just the unemployment rate, but the underemployment rate. So we know that the unemployment rate doesn't capture the fact that some discouraged people have dropped out of the workforce, that some people are working part-time because they can't find full-time jobs, and so they look at this expanded unemployment rate, and that one's still over 13%. But that too has come down since the peak. It's come down quite a few percentage points. So even though there's a lot of sort of hidden unhappiness out there because of these differences in the numbers, we believe that that sort of hidden unemployment is also coming down. One of the puzzling things, though, is that a lot of people have dropped out of the labor force. They're not looking for work. That has tended to flatter the unemployment picture. But we don't know why they dropped out, because they're not reporting themselves as discouraged. They're not saying we've given up the job hunt. They seem to have retired, I don't know, gone back to school. Perhaps they want to stay home with their children. And therefore, we do not believe that a lot of these people who disappeared from the labor force in the last 5 years are ever going to come back.
Let me jump in and get a call from Dwayne from Marlboro, Maryland, just outside D.C., an independent. Hey, Dwayne.
Yes, how are you?
Good morning, sir.
Thanks for hearing me.
Of course.
I appreciate your show. Well, I just wanted to touch real quick on the direct emphasis that I don't see put on the Americans who've lost their jobs in the field of finance, in the car industry. I lost my job in finance. Company closed down because of, we all know why. I actually went back into the car business, making $7 an hour. Okay, working 60 hours a week with a big hope of a commission one day. When everyone has the internet information on cars now, there's no money in that. A salary needs to be maybe put in place, and that is, I think, on the borderline of slave labor these days, with a pipe dream hope of 1970s, 1980s payday. When the information wasn't out there on how to buy a car. Hey, kudos to the information. Everybody needs to save money, but something needs to be done as well for the employee in that company. So right now, I'm totally struggling, making not even a third of what I made 5 years ago. And the attitudes that I get in the community I'm in is if the economy never affected anyone, and why aren't you in a blue-collar job where we're not affected? So where's the emphasis on that direct point of the person that was in that field that was directly affected?
Thanks for calling, Dwayne.
So the caller is unfortunately illustrating something very important, which is that even though a lot of jobs have come back, a lot of those jobs are not paying what they did 4 or 5 years ago, and people like Dwayne find themselves working very hard for less money than they did 5 to 6 years ago. Generally speaking, the government support programs that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years have not been aimed at specific industries. You could say that the bailouts that we had for Wall Street, which were broadly aimed at stabilizing the financial system, did save some jobs in the finance sector, but it's certainly not the case that finance is coming back to the size it was back in the in 2006, 2007. We had a lot of people working to finance mortgages that simply were not sustainable. We know that now. And the same in the automobile industry. The big three were too large. They had too much capacity. It was necessary to cut those jobs back. Even now, as we cut back stimulus programs, we're looking around for ways to retrain those who are unemployed or underemployed. But as Dwayne said, the jobs are different today than they were 6 or 7 years ago. A car salesman is dealing with a different type of consumer today when the internet and Kelley Blue Book prices and all that stuff is available to him than 7 or 8 years ago. That means it's not easy to say specifically how do we aim our retraining and job creation resources. And
let me get your perspective on some other numbers. This from November 2013, job gains, job losses by sector. Professional and business services gained 35,000 jobs recently. Transportation and warehousing, 31,000. Healthcare, 28,000, a continuing big growing field. Manufacturing, 27,000. Does that surprise you at all, the manufacturing number?
It doesn't, but that number jumps around a lot.
And then the construction area, 17,000. And the federal government, minus, lost, reduced by 7,000. Any other insight you want to give us on those?
Well, so you've picked up on some relatively important trends. One is that a consistent source of job creation in the last 4 or 5 years has been the service sector, in particular education and healthcare. Healthcare partly because we are an aging society, our people are steadily consuming more healthcare, partly because those are areas where people are less able to cut back when times are tough. Manufacturing, as we were discussing, was hit very hard during the recession. It's made steady but not spectacular progress in the last 5 or 6 years. The construction numbers I find most encouraging because one of the biggest obstacles for our economy to overcome has been the lack of housing as that traditional springboard to faster growth. Usually when the economy came back, it was led by housing, but in this case, housing held it back. The fact that home builders are more and more optimistic that the traffic is picking up at model homes and so forth, that more and more people can now get mortgages to buy a new home is very encouraging for that sector, for the construction industry. Government, again, has been a major drag on the economy since the stimulus program expired 2 or 3 years ago. It's been a steady subtraction from economic growth since 2011. But in the third quarter, for the first time in a number of years, the federal government stopped subtracting from economic growth. So that's one reason I'm relatively optimistic, not outrageously optimistic, but relatively optimistic that next year will be a better year because we will not have that enormous weight of the federal government around our ankles.
As we take our next call, we'll look at a Wall Street Journal headline about housing, which our guest just mentioned, Housing 2014, Steadier and Sturdier. There's the headline. And we take a call from Lawrenceville, Georgia now, Republican line. It's Ed. Hey, Ed.
Hi. I think Gregory ought to travel around a little bit more and see America. There's a lot of malls that are doing badly. There's a lot of strip malls that are empty. A whole bunch of businesses are closing or not reopening. And then yesterday I found out that the poor people who are going to be having to depend on, they're going to be forced to take Medicaid, are going to be subject to confiscation of all their property after they die, because it's a welfare program that states will have to recoup their money. So they're going to confiscate all the property of all these poor people. They won't even be able to leave an old television to their children.
Gregory Ip.
I'm not familiar with what he's talking about, this provision of the Medicaid program. But speaking of the state of retail around the country, caller's absolutely right. There are a lot of pockets of the economy, not even pockets, swaths of the economy, that have not recovered. The retail sector is dealing not just with the overall weakness of consumer demand and consumer confidence, but also the ongoing migration of retail sales from brick and mortar to the internet. We're still seeing strong growth, albeit not as hectic as it was a few years ago, in the online sales, while retail, traditional brick and mortar retail continues to struggle.
Doug is on the line from Wilmington, North Carolina, independent caller. Good morning to you, sir.
Good morning. How are you today?
Doing well.
Hey, there's so many people out there talking about the Federal Reserve. I think people are starting to wake up, aside from the puff pieces on 60 Minutes. And I'm not exactly sure why your guest is carrying the water for the Fed. But people, the American people really ought to understand that the founding fathers knew that central banks would ruin this country. Thomas Jefferson had a quote, and he said he believes that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Then he goes on to say, if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of the currency, firstly by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and the corporations that will grow up around will deprive people of all property until the children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. Now, our founding fathers understood 200 years ago how dangerous these institutions are. The American people don't understand that the Fed is a private bank. Woodrow Wilson, when he died, lamented the fact that he allowed the Federal Reserve to come into being. We had a central bank, the first national bank of the United States. We had a second national bank of the United States. The last one, Andrew Jackson got rid of. I don't understand, first of all, why your guest is carrying the water for the central banks and the Federal Reserve, which is unconstitutional.
Well, let me jump in. You said he's carrying the water. What was it that he said or reported on? It got your attention.
he's not telling the people the truth. He seems to think that this economy is going to get better, and clearly, if anybody, even if they don't have any kind of implicit knowledge of economics, they can look at this economy, and while the Federal Reserve keeps printing money, that powers the speculative economy.
All right, Doug, let me jump in, and before we get a response, got to tell you, Greg, there's a little bit of trend on our tweets that are coming in about the Fed. Mostly negative. Here is just one more. Isn't it time to stop the Fed from driving the economy? Let the private sector take the wheel. Government gets out of the way? Question mark. Go ahead.
So I think what these callers need to recognize is that we tried that. So it's ironic that Thomas Jefferson complained about what would happen if private banks controlled the issuance of currency. Well, in the absence of a central bank, that's exactly what happened. Private banks issued their own currency. But periodically, a private bank would fail. Everybody would demand their currency back. They couldn't get it, and a panic would sweep the country and would fall into depression. And so the years without central banks, whether it was the first or second Bank of the United States or the Federal Reserve, were frequently subject to panics, the most serious of which was in 1907, the Panic of 1907, which didn't stop until private banks put an end to it, and the economy had suffered a severe loss in output. So the Federal Reserve is not perfect, but it seems better than the alternative, which is to not have some sort of public institution that can supply newly created liquidity when everybody else needs safety and wants cash. It is the case that the Federal Reserve has not always done that job adequately. They allowed the Great Depression to happen. They allowed the great inflation of the 1970s to happen. But what we have seen in every country, not just the United States, is that in absent some overall public authority to control the issuance of currency, panic happens, and inevitably the public will demand a return to that public oversight. The caller is wrong to say that the Federal Reserve is a private bank. That is not true. Private banks own very small minority shares of the regional reserve banks. They have no say in the appointment of the presidents, and the entire and monetary policy is controlled by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve in Washington, all of whose governors are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate.
Looks like Janet Yellen will be the next chair of the Fed. Nomination wasn't quite finished before Congress went out, but they'll take it up in January. What will she be bringing to the table over there?
You know, she will be one of the most qualified individuals that's ever been named to this position. Not only is she an outstanding academic economist, she has spent many years on the Federal Reserve itself, the last 3 or 4 at the elbow of Ben Bernanke, the current chairman, as the Fed's vice chairman. So she'll have extraordinary experience, extraordinary ability, and I think at this point in time she will also bring continuity. And when the Federal Reserve is in the process of exiting these very unconventional experimental programs, then that's something that would be very valuable. Now, to the extent that you think that the current leadership of the Fed has missed something, for example, it's overdoing it with the money printing, that it has not been sufficiently appreciative of the limits to what it can do and perhaps the risks it's storing up for the future, well then Janet Yellen will have that same blind spot because she's been part and parcel of the leadership that has produced the policy that we have today.
Our guest is Gregory Ip, who is U.S. economics editor at The Economist, and he was chief economics correspondent at the Wall Street Journal for a number of years, 12 years. Educated at Carleton University, which is in Ottawa, in Ontario, Canada. Our next call is from Al from Detroit. Al is a Democrat. Welcome to the program. Al, turn the sound down on your set if you can. We'll hear you much better.
Thank you. How are you doing?
Hi, Al.
Doing well, sir. Welcome. Al, go ahead and turn the sound down on your set.
Okay. I'm sorry.
We'll ask other folks to do the same. We'll hear you much better. Go ahead, Al.
Okay. Can you explain to the people that most of our businesses went overseas, and that's the reason why that we don't have any jobs here of any significance that pays the middle class income, because all the jobs that used to pay that amount overseas are steel, textiles. We don't make anything, shoes, furniture. Everything is gone. And essentially, that's where our middle class went. And can you explain to them that Nixon went to China, and the Republicans' policy was to have businesses have the opportunities over in foreign countries with lower wages or no wages at all. And that's where our businesses went to.
Let's hear from our guest.
So if you look over the grand sweep of time since the end of the Second World War, the size of the manufacturing sector, whether they're making cars or shoes or clothing, has shrunken overall relative to the rest of the economy. This didn't just happen in the last 10 years when China joined the world trading system. It's been going on for a number of decades. And the primary driver has not been companies upping and moving to other countries. It's because they have gotten more productive. It takes far fewer workers, far fewer hours to make a car or a pair of shoes today. Now, at the same time, some of these countries did take jobs away making textiles, for example, because they could do it more cheaply. This didn't necessarily subtract from jobs in the United States because the people who might have been making shoes found other jobs, often doing things that paid as well, if not better, you know, reading x-rays or teaching early childhood education. Now, however, in the last 10 or 15 years, there was a very large offshoring movement where a lot of very good paying jobs did leave for China. We believe that that has now slowed down significantly for a number of reasons. A lot of the most obvious jobs that you could offshore have already gone. Labor costs in China have gone up a lot. The US dollar is lower, and so that seems to have slowed to a trickle, and we're actually seeing scattered reports of companies bringing jobs back. And if you look at the growth of imports, manufactured imports in this country, it's been quite a bit slower than the growth of manufactured exports. So we seem to be making some progress, clawing back some of the global market share that we lost in the years up to.
The timing of this part of the conversation is interesting. The New York Times has a lead story this morning. In case you're interested in a little bit more on the manufacturing aspect, buying overseas clothing is the headline. Buying overseas clothing, U.S. is flouting its own advice. Government suppliers offer low prices, but working conditions can be harsh. They say that U.S. is one of the world's biggest clothing buyers, $1.5 billion a year. This country buys at foreign factories overseas, acquiring everything from the royal blue shirts worn by airport security to the olive button-downs for forest rangers. It goes on and on. But it says that even though the administration has called on Western buyers to use their purchasing power to push for improved working conditions in industry after several workplace disasters over the last 13 months, the American government has done little to adjust its own shopping habits. Not sure if you had a chance to see that story.
I glanced at it, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting. The issue you're talking about, I think it was last April when a large factory in Bangladesh collapsed, killing over 1,000 workers. And both the European Union and the United States applied diplomatic and trade pressure to Bangladesh to try and do something to improve conditions for workers, to enforce their own labor standards, to prevent recurrences of this. Industries that, whether it's Nike or others, who outsource the manufacturing of apparel to factories in Bangladesh have been urged to take more seriously some of the codes of conduct meant to prevent this kind of behavior. Now, the Obama administration has taken a much tougher stance on this than its predecessors, partly because organized labor, a big supporter of the administration, has been pressing for this type of these types of demands to be made on Bangladesh for a long time. But I think that it's important to be realistic here. Even if these factories, not just in Bangladesh or Vietnam or China, were able to, or were brought along to come up fully to the expectations in these various codes of conduct about labor safety, it wouldn't bring any jobs back to the United States. We're still talking about hourly labor rates in those countries that are far lower than those that would be commanded here in the United States. Let's
get Tom on the line from Littleton, Colorado. Thanks for waiting, Tom.
Yeah, hi, good morning.
Good morning.
Hi, I just had actually just had one comment, but I wanted to follow up on what the guest said about the Federal Reserve. I'm not particularly against the Federal Reserve. However, I'm a little bit concerned about how monetary policy is used to be a de facto taxation when they drop interest rates and take money from people who are on fixed incomes and so forth and redistribute that to people who are trying to get out from under their homes. The fact that that's not directly under the purview of the Congress is a little bit concerning. But my main comment is I just wanted to wish everybody a happy 100th birthday on the the Fed and the 16th Amendment. 100 years ago, the country's changed quite a bit. Right now, when we talk about economic, fixes, the Republicans talk about cut spending, and Democrats talk about, raising taxes. But you don't really hear a lot of people talk about the third option of taking our income tax out of the price of our products overseas and adding that to the tax of the price of the products sold within the United States, which of course would be H.R. 25, the Fair Tax Act of 2013. I'd like to hear the guest's thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Tom.
I'm not familiar with the bill that the caller has talked about. So there are various things. For example, a lot of people have talked about the creation of a value-added tax, which would be interesting because a value-added tax would be levied on purely domestic production and on imports, anything consumed here in the United States, but it'd be excluded from anything that was exported. So that would be a tax innovation that would help the export competitiveness of the United States and give domestic producers a bit more of a competitive leg up. I do want to touch on one thing the caller talked about, which was, I hear this a lot, about how the Federal Reserve is basically punishing savers to help borrowers, those whose houses are underwater. The fact of the matter is that monetary policy is a very blunt instrument. It cannot pick and choose who it helps and who it hurts. And when interest rates were high, the opposite was happening. It was hurting borrowers and helping savers. So the question to ask is not whether it hurts or helps some people and others. It's whether on net the country is better off. And what the Federal Reserve has concluded is that holding interest rates extremely low creates enough additional demand for goods and services that it puts people back to work. People back to work earn more money. With that money, they can eventually accumulate savings again. And so look at that holistically. This policy may hurt some savers in the short term, but over the long term, it helps the majority of the country get jobs and to save. They may be wrong in the end. Maybe the policy won't work out. But based on the analysis they have now, I think they're probably right.
Speaking of legislation before Congress went out, they did not extend the unemployment insurance, something we've been talking about a little bit. Wall Street Journal has this chart, sort of an interactive chart without unemployment extension. Which states would be the hardest hit? As the camera pans down, we can see a good chunk of the West Coast hardest hit by the lack of congressional action. A little bit in the central here, especially Illinois, and then several states back east. Looks like Pennsylvania and New York and others. Want to speak more to the prospects of an extension of this jobless insurance? And if it doesn't get extended, does it have an impact on the economy?
So the administration and Patty Murray, the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, had hoped to include an extension of unemployment insurance benefits in the budget agreement. That was not possible. The Republicans have taken a very strong view that there should not be extensions to unemployment insurance. And more important, it would have had a price tag on the order, I think, of about $25 billion that would have even more severely busted through the so-called sequester spending caps and required offsets somewhere else that they were not able to find. Now, we will have more budget negotiations in the new year. In particular, the statutory limit on how much the federal government may borrow will be reached sometime near the end of February. And at that point, there has to be an agreement by the Congress to raise that limit. To the extent that there's going to be any negotiation on that at all, the administration would like to see additional unemployment insurance benefits extended. My own view is that it's probably not going to happen. I think that we're now 5 years into the recovery, and although an economic case could be made that you still want additional purchasing power in the hands of the unemployed, the political system is just not there yet. The resistance on the part of Republicans is too great, and the Democrats do not want it badly enough to have a big fight.
One viewer, one tweeter wants to dig in a little bit on your comments before on the underemployed. What's the percentage of the underemployed out there right now, and who subsidizes them?
Well, there's quite a few ways of measuring this question, but one very broad way of looking at it is that if you look at the population of over the age of 16, roughly, I want to say it's about 60%, 59 to 60% of them are employed. So that means we have 40% who are non-employed. And the question is, why are those people not working? Well, a lot of them have retired, older people especially. A lot of them are parents who are staying at home with small children. A lot of them have a disability or some other thing that's keeping them from being able to work. And then a lot of them are the officially unemployed. These are people who are looking for work and tell the government when they're asked that they're looking for work. There's a chunk of people, as we were talking about earlier, that are not officially unemployed but also do not seem to show up in any of these other categories, and we don't really know what's happened to them. So it's probably the case that, for example, some of the people who are officially employed are working part-time. They like to have longer hours, but they can't find them. But a lot of these other people may have run out of their unemployment insurance benefits and applied to the disability program to get disability benefits as almost a form of backup unemployment insurance. Unfortunately, what we know is that once you're on if you're applying for disability or receiving disability, you can't work. You're not allowed to work. And so this program actually becomes a big disincentive to get back into the workforce. people who enter the disability program, only about 4% leave it in the next 10 years. So one of the broader questions the country has to do is to rethink the way it does reemployment programs, retraining programs, to get some of these people we need their skills, we need their work, we need their contribution to keep the economy going. And right now there aren't a lot of jobs waiting for them, but over the next 10 or 15 years hopefully there will be, and we'll find a way to get these underemployed and unemployed and non-employed back in the job market.
Back to the phones to Randy in Sacramento, California, Democrat. Welcome.
I just wanted to say that I haven't been working for the past couple of months, and a couple of years, and I just started a part-time job, but I tried to apply for the health program, and they said because I haven't filed income tax that I'm not qualified for any health insurance. And then also, I've been a truck driver for 20 years, and going all over the U.S. delivering, all types of produce and you name it, all over the U.S. When I get to the warehouse, I'd say all the way up to Illinois, even Idaho. When I get to these huge name brand warehouses, they're generally 99% of the time it's been all illegal Mexicans who are working in the warehouses, and they're just one or two white guys who are in charge. But these guys, they don't even speak English. You ask them about Social Security number, they don't understand that. And then the ones who do speak English, they talk about how we just come here and work, and then we send all of our money back to Mexico, and then all the seasonal jobs, all for produce and all the food, it's the same thing. They work during the season, and then they go back to Mexico, but they still collect unemployment from the U.S. And it's like, the government is not even trying to find out about these people. But I'm telling you, there's a lot of people out there who could have a lot of good jobs if they would get the illegals out of there, or at least find out whether they're going to be living in the U.S. or in Mexico.
All right, Randy, left a lot on the table there. Anything you want to respond to?
Well, Randy's obviously talking about an issue that's been a hot-button issue for a number of years in this country, and of course it's at the heart of what we do about reforming immigration in this country. And it is the case that there are a lot of immigrants, many of them undocumented, like Randy has encountered, working in this country, especially in segments like food processing, like agriculture, like construction, and the like, and those are jobs that some other people would perhaps be working at if the undocumented weren't there. Now, trend-wise, it's interesting to note that figures from organizations like the Pew and the Department of Homeland Security strongly suggest that the number of undocumented immigrants coming into the United States has drastically declined in the last 4 or 5 years. It may be the case that the population of undocumented immigrants is today really not much different from where it was 5 or 6 years ago for several reasons. First of all, border apprehension has stepped up considerably in the last 4 or 5 years. Second, the economy's been weak in a lot of the sectors that were most attractive to illegal immigrants, like construction, have been especially weak. And finally, Mexico's economy has actually been doing quite well. And the economic imperative for people to leave Mexico and come to the United States is not as strong as it once was. Final thing that's interesting, Paul, is demographics. The birth rate and the fertility rate in Mexico has plummeted in the last 30 or 40 years. The average new family in Mexico is not much larger than it is in the United States. As a result, the pool of people who used to leave their hometown and come to the United States to make their fortune is a much smaller pool than it was before. And I think that in the next 5 or 10 years, a lot of the things that have really exercised people about this large pool of undocumented workers, a lot of those forces will have dissipated considerably.
Here is an email that connects healthcare to the economy for Greg Ip. Do you expect the full implementation of Obamacare to have no ill effects on the U.S. economy? Many Americans will be diverting money to health insurance that they weren't required to pay for previously. This is from Keyport, New Jersey.
So there's a number of aspects of the health care law which don't actually add or subtract money from the economy, that they move it around. So as the caller indicated, a lot of young people will be paying, young healthy people will be paying for insurance plans that they perhaps wouldn't have wanted or needed absent this law. And the extra profit that the insurance companies make on those plans are used to subsidize the plans of older, sicker people who otherwise couldn't have obtained coverage. That doesn't add or subtract money in the economy. It just moves it from one group of people to another group of people. In addition, there were a number of taxes put in place actually a year earlier this year, a Medicare tax designed to help pay for the program. That will take spending power out of those upper income people who have to pay the tax, but again, it goes to pay for health insurance and health care for those who didn't have it before. So on net, it'll be kind of a wash. Over the long term, though, there are some additional effects. On the positive side, people who now have health insurance might be able to move more easily and not worry about losing a job when they move. On the negative side, some people who used to work because that's how they got their health insurance won't feel it's as necessary to work if they're just on the borderline. And they may drop out of the workforce because they can now get lower cost health insurance through Obamacare. And that could aggravate the tendency we've seen of the labor force to shrink.
Last couple calls here. JW hanging on from South Bend, Indiana. Welcome to the program. You're an independent. JW, are you there?
Oh, yes, I'm here. Yes, okay, I would like to know what would happen to, okay, it's like my grandfather, he deceased, right? And he had a trust fund set up for my father. And when he deceased, the lawyers, they wouldn't give him his inheritance or anything. What would happen to that?
That sounds like a question of trust and estate law. I just don't really think I can answer that with any authority.
Let's move on to Sharon then. Sharon will be our last call from Texas City in Texas, Republican. Hey, Sharon.
Hey, good morning and Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you. I have a question about the Federal Reserve. We are coming to the end of our 100-year charter with the Federal Reserve, and I'd like to know if we have signed another one or not. I'm a Ron Paul Republican, and I understand that this is a debt-based system with fiat currency. We do not have money anymore because it's not backed by gold and silver, which our government has the authority constitutionally to coin our money without interest. So we're paying the Federal Reserve interest to print our currency, a fiat currency, and fractional reserve banking. And I hope people will get behind Campaign for Liberty and Rand Paul in forcing an audit of the Fed. But do you know if we're stuck with the Federal Reserve for another 100 years or not?
When the Federal Reserve was first created in 1913, it had a 20-year charter, but in 1927, an act of Congress repealed the requirement that charter come up for regular renewal. And so the Federal Reserve is basically with us until Congress decides we don't need a Federal Reserve any longer. It will not simply sunset. Now, to the point that we would be somehow better off with a currency that was convertible to gold or silver on demand, as Ron Paul would like, I just do not believe that theory or history or experience supports that at all. We had over 100 years experience with a gold standard in this country, and we had many severe depressions and panics related to the fact that it's human nature that, when times are good, even a financial system backed by gold lends too much, and that when everybody wants their gold back, the system can't support it, and the financial system collapses. So essentially, there's an old, to paraphrase a famous economist, whatever monetary system you have, one day you'll wish for a different one. And that was definitely the case when we had money that was backed by gold and silver. And to go back to something I said earlier, for all the mistakes the Fed has made and the crisis we've experienced under the Federal Reserve, it's not obvious to me that the period that we had without a central bank was any better.
Our guest has been Greg Ip, U.S. economics editor for The Economist. Thanks a lot for your time and your insight this Monday morning.